Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 53, the Song of the Fool, but this is the remix edition. The reason I call it is because when we look at Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, Psalm 53 is the one we're doing here, they are almost identical. There will be a few differences, but it's largely going to be the same psalm. So if we look at the whole structure of the book of Psalms, book one is chapters 1 through 41, and that includes Psalm 14. Um, One of the things that we see there is that book one uses the term Yahweh to speak of God 278 times, as opposed to using the term Elohim, that's the Hebrew word for God, only 15 times. So usually it's talking about the name of God rather than the title of who he is. When we come to book two, and Psalm 53 is part of book two, this time we're going to see Elohim used 198 times, and by contrast, Yahweh is only going to be used 32 times, and I don't think it's going to be used at all in this particular psalm. Now, why is that? What happened? I suspect that early on they were using the name of God, and yet there came a time where they began to think, there's actually a law against using God's name in a light or vain way, that it ought to be used in a serious way. And so let's be safe and let's not use his name so often. It's not that they stopped it altogether, but they said for the most part we're going to use the term Elohim, which means God, when we want to speak of him rather than the divine name. That that movement took place not only in Judaism, but when we first see the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. They followed the same practice. In fact, I don't think there's a place where the Septuagint ever uses the divine name. And in many of our translations, including the New American Standard that I'm using for this class, they followed the same practice, usually, the great majority of times. Once in a while, they'll use the divine name, because because they almost can't help it, because it's the passage is making a point of it. But usually they'll use the word Lord in all capital letters, telling you that's the divine name, but we're not going to spell it out. Of course, when we do that, that's only in the Old Testament. The New Testament never uses the divine name, again, because it was written in Greek, and they're probably using the Septuagint when they're quoting the Old Testament scriptures. Now, Psalm 14 then and Psalm 53, and I've put these, Psalm 14 is from book one, Psalm 53 is from book two, and I put them side by side. Now, they each have a superscription, and the superscription is a little bit different when we come to book two. We're going to come back and look at that. We're just looking at the big picture now. And then in the opening verses, notice it says, the fool has said in his heart, there's no God. Both have that term Elohim for God. They're corrupt because they have committed abominable deeds. Oh, look over at Psalm 53. They have committed abominable injustice. That's actually a difference in the Hebrew text. So there are a few little tiny differences. We continue where the Lord has looked down from heaven. That's the name of God. That's Yahweh, as opposed to Psalm 53, where God has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men. Notice they have all turned aside in Psalm 53. Every one of them has turned aside. It means the same thing, but the wording, both in the English translation and in the Hebrew text, is slightly different. Next, we see in Psalm 14, do all the workers of wickedness not know? Versus Psalm 53, have the workers of wickedness no knowledge? It's saying sort of the same thing. It's almost exactly, but there are some differences. And then notice the term for Lord and the term for God that's used at the end of that section. We go in book one. There they are in great dread. Now this is sort of humorous because in book two, Psalm 53, there they were in great fear, and you say, well, that's sort of the same thing. Actually, the Hebrew is identical. In the Hebrew, it's the term fakadu, uh, fakad, excuse me. It's actually the same word twice. When you want to say something is really great or something is terrific or it's really going to happen, you say it twice in the Hebrew text. For example, in Genesis chapter 2, where God says, "In the day you eat of it, You will certainly die. And actually, the Hebrew says, die and you will die. It's not two deaths. It means it's really going to happen. Here again, they're in dreadful dread, we would say. But it's the same word. And the translators, for reasons unknown, rendered one in Psalm 14, they rendered it dread. In Psalm 53, they rendered it fear. It's the same Hebrew word. Like, choose one and be consistent. One of my little pet peeves, once in a while, the New American Standard does it. They're usually better than this, but it probably needs some further editing. Shame on them. Note now, here's an actual difference. For God is with the righteous. This is in Psalm 14. For God is with the righteous generation. You would put to shame the counsel of the afflicted, but the Lord is his refuge. Notice in Psalm 53, for God scattered the bones of him who encamped against you. Now, it still talks about how you put them to shame because God has rejected them. So Lord versus God. But there's actually a bit of difference, probably the most difference of any portion that we've seen throughout these two Psalms are in this short 3 lines. And then finally, when the Lord restores his captive people and when God restores his captive people, Jacob will rejoice, or let Jacob rejoice. It's the same sort of idea. Israel will be glad, let Israel be glad. So it's close, but it's not exact. Now, the big question is, why is this psalm repeated? Yes, there are a few small differences, but it's basically the same psalm. Why the repetition? And I think there's 3 reasons. First of all, for the emphasis of repetition. I just said, when you want to say something's really important, or you say it, it's, like you're surely going to die, you're certainly going to die, you say it twice. You do that with words, but you also do that in other places for emphasis. And this is the emphasis of repetition. I think that the psalmists are telling us, whoever's collecting the psalms, is telling us this is an important one. It was so important we decided to put it in again later on. Secondly, because this psalm, at this point in book 2, it fits into the context of this particular section. It really, it almost calls for, hey, remember that psalm? You need to stick it in here again because it is so germane, it is so relevant to this section of the Psalms that talks about foolish people and people that are against God, and it fits. It fits like a key into the keyhole. I'm not saying Psalm 14 doesn't, but Psalm 53 especially, and I suspect that the order of the books of Psalms, the way they are probably the order in which they were collected. Now, I think we're going to see that, especially when we come to the end of book 2, but I'm going to save that for then. A third reason is because of the foolishness of denying God's existence continues even to this day. I was just reading a note, supposedly a quote, supposedly by a well-known evolutionist, and if I said his name, you would know it, but I'm not going to do that. And he says, "I see no evidence of intelligent life bringing about the universe, an intelligent mind or anything like that." And I thought to myself, well, I don't see any, I don't see any sign of intelligent communication coming out of your mouth. I think that sort of foolishness continues even to this day, and so it bears repeating. With that, let's jump in first of all to the superscription. It's a little bit different than the one in Psalm 14. For the choir director, according to Mahalet, and that Mahalet, al Mahalet, the al part is according to or upon Mahalet. That would be a good translation. Now, that term Mahalet is feminine plural. Now, when I say that, remember that all Hebrew words are either masculine or plural. You cannot say it in Hebrew. There's no neuter. All words are masculine or feminine. And this term Mahalet is feminine. It's a girl's name. And as such, it's used as the name of the daughter of Ishmael in Genesis chapter 28, verse 9. Also, the granddaughter of David and Abigail had this name. Now you say, well, that's sort of unusual to have a plural word for a girl's name. I guess it's sort of unusual, but it's not unknown even in English. I've got a friend, and I hope she won't mind me using her as an illustration. Towns, if you're listening in, that's her name. That's actually her middle name. She goes by her middle name instead of her first name. I'm not going to share the first name because I'm not sure everybody knows it. But Towns, it's not town like Town, it's Towns plural. Or think of the boy's name Miles. You say, well, why can't you just be 1 mile? That's just the way some names go, and that's the case here. Now, was this a reference to a musical instrument? Perhaps that could be, or is it some sort of tune that was used? Maybe sort of a high flowing, like soprano tune. Again, that's a possibility, but we don't know. And so those are just good guesses, and maybe they're not all that good guesses. So it's according to Mahalet, and then a maskil. By the way, before I leave, Psalm 88 verse 1 is going to see the same term, the Mahalet. So we'll see it again one more time before we leave the Psalms. And then this called a maskil of David, and we've already noted in the past that that term maskil comes from the root sakal, it means to instruct, which tells me that this is a wisdom psalm, and we've seen some wisdom psalms recently, and this is one of those. It is meant to impart wisdom. With that, let's jump now into the psalm itself, following the superscription. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. That is the attitude that the Bible takes of atheism, that the idea that there is no God is just foolish. For example, when I set out to do this recording, I did not begin with an explanation of how you can know that I exist. I just took it for granted. And God does the same thing. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He doesn't start with 18 reasons why you can know that God exists. He just says that it's sort of obvious. I'm speaking. And so notice, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So the fool speaks about God and thinks that there is no God. But notice then God comes back and talks about the fool. They are corrupt, and so he's going to speak about the fool. They are corrupt and have committed abominable injustice. There's no one who does good. Notice that the no one is beyond just the fool. I think it's going to be bigger than that, but let's look at that. We see in verse 2, God has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men. Notice he just doesn't say he's looked down upon the atheists or he's looked down upon the foolish people. But for a moment, that looking is going to get bigger as God looks upon all men. That's what sons of men just refers to people. To see if there is anyone who understands, who seeks after God. Every one of them has turned aside. Together, they have become corrupt. There's no one who does good, not even one. And so he begins by looking at the fool who said in his heart, there's no God. But then he expands that judgment to refer to all people. Now, what's true then of the fool is also true of all mankind. The Apostle Paul takes this idea, actually takes this passage, and he quotes from it to Romans chapter 3, and he's been building a case of against the righteousness of mankind. In fact, he's saying that man isn't righteous. They're actually the polar opposite. What then? Are we better than they? Are we Jews better than those Gentiles? Not at all, for we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. Now, Jewish people, they believed that God was there. They had the scriptures. They had read the scriptures. The Greeks, as a rule, didn't have any of that. Yeah, there were a few Greeks that had read maybe a translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. But for the most part, Greeks were ignorant of all that. And yet both Jews and Greeks, both the people that believed that there was a God, that God existed, as well as the Greeks that they believed in a whole bunch of different gods, they are all under sin, as it is written. And now we have the quote from both Psalm 14 I put here, but also it's the same passage in Psalm 53. There's none righteous, not even one. There's none who understands. There's none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There's none who does good. There's not even one. And the passage goes on from there. We're not going to go look at the rest of this. But what Paul is telling us is that the principle that we saw in Psalm 14 and in Psalm 53 is a universal principle, not just to the person who's the atheist, but to all mankind. So let's go back. Verse 4 now. Have the workers of wickedness no knowledge, who eat up my people as though they ate bread. Now that's a figure of speech. That simile is a figure of speech, and yet it's pointing out a truth. And notice they've not called upon God. It is that the wicked not only don't believe in God, but they actually hate God and they hate the people of God. Now you say, well, wait a minute. How can they hate God if they don't believe that God's even there? They hate the idea of God. And I've seen this personally. I can think of some folks that I've talked to over the years that will say, well, I'm an atheist. And it's rare to find somebody who actually says they're an atheist. Usually, if you press them, you'll say, an atheist is somebody who knows absolutely there is no God. If you're not entirely sure, if you can't say with certainty that God might be out there, maybe hiding beyond the rings of Saturn or something like that, then really what you're doing is you're taking the position of an agnostic. You're saying I don't know. And I've had people who at first said they were an atheist, and then I explained the difference between atheism versus agnosticism, and then they would correct themselves and they'd say, "Okay, I see your point. Really, I'm an agnostic. I don't know if there's a God, and I don't think so, but I don't know absolutely." And at that point, I say, "Well, let me tell you about the God you don't know." And Paul took the same approach over in Acts chapter 17. But somebody who is an atheist who says, "Look, I'm convinced that there is no God." They don't say that in the same way that I'm convinced that there's no Rumpelstiltskin, or take any sort of legendary, story that there's no Santa Claus in the sense of somebody who's got a white beard and I'm convinced of that, but I don't really hate it. I may think it's sort of silly, but I don't have a hatred of those imaginary characters. But atheists, if you press them, the more they come in contact with it, the more they will, and I've seen this, actually hate the idea of God, and that will splash over because you can hate God all you want, but you can't get at him. But they will then try to get at the followers of God. And we see this in history, actually in the recent history within my lifetime, where there have been nations that set themselves up as an atheistic nation who actively sought to persecute and to imprison and even put to death those who believe in God. And let me say, we Christians should not act the same way toward them. Is there a spiritual war going on? Yes, there is, but it's a spiritual war, and our weapons are not shotguns and knives and things like that. We have spiritual weapons. So I think there is a conflict going on. But notice, have the workers of wickedness no knowledge, who eat up my people, and that's the hatred being manifested, and they can't get at God, so they will get at God's people, as though they hate bread and have not called upon God. Verse 5, there they were in great fear, where no fear had been. Not only is there a hatred, but notice the wicked have a fear. People that are against God, that are against the idea of God, people that are atheists have a great fear that they might be wrong and that God really might be there. And if he really is there, then they get the point they're going to be judged. And so they will deny, but really there's an undercurrent, if truth be told, an undercurrent of fear where no fear had been. For God scattered the bones of him who encamped against you. Now notice the you is not speaking to the unbeliever, it's speaking to the reader who does believe that God's there, and versus him who encamped against you. Notice the him versus the you. You put them to shame because God had rejected them. Let me just say, you're going to win the battle. not because you're stronger, but because God is bigger and God's going to win. And if you're on his side, if you have turned your loyalty to him, if you've trusted in him as your Lord and Savior, then you are on the winning side. And so there is a continuing conflict even to this day. Sometimes physical, sometimes I don't think our side should be physical. I think our side is called to be spiritual, and the weapons of our warfare are the Word of God. The just the truth, speaking the truth. But remember, speak the truth in love. Verse 6, and we're coming to our conclusion now. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. So here's a closing prayer, but it's a prayer of faith. Notice the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. So that salvation, yes, even our salvation, is connected to a place. It's connected to Israel. It's connected to Zion. If you don't think that, then go back and read the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and see where the work of salvation was accomplished. Yes, upon the cross. But where was that cross located? It was located in Jerusalem. It was located in ancient Israel. And so notice his prayer, oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. Now, David's writing this. This is being written long before Jesus had arrived. So this is an Old Testament prophecy looking forward to what God would do when God came, when he sent his Messiah, when he sent his son. As he puts it here, when God restores his captive people. Let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. When I read about the restoration of his captive people, that doesn't really sound like David. That really sounds like the Babylonian captivity and the restoration that came out of that. And I think it's looking forward to that. But it doesn't stop there. It looks forward to a bigger, more universal restoration. You see, they came back into the land and they rebuilt the temple. But eventually, Jesus came and stood in that same temple and said, destroy this temple, not the physical one of brick and mortar, but the temple of his body, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. And he did. And when you trust in him, then you find that your captivity to sin, your captivity to fear, your captivity to an enmity against God, that has all been replaced by something wondrous and wonderful. And you can find yourself back, can I say it this way, back home with God through what Christ did to bring you back into God's forever family.